thrilled to welcome you today, Tony, to host the session. Thank you so much. Tony is the CEO of K2 Business Partners, and they've been supporting SMEs since 2001 to help them go through kind of restructuring and to support them through a turnaround plan. So K2 are an investor as well, and he's going to share some insight and experiences that he's had through his career. As always, we want it to be an interactive session, so we thought maybe the best bet would be to pop anything into the chat box and we can just address those throughout the presentation. And please do feel free to interject, ask questions, or share experiences. So with that, I'm going to mute myself and pass it to you, Tony. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. So I'm going to apologise. I'm going to flick you all to PowerPoint. This isn't death by PowerPoint, but it allows me to show you some interesting pictures as much as anything else to talk to them. So here we go. I'm hoping everyone can see on their screen a slide. And what I'll do is I'll use the PowerPoint and then I'll switch it off when we have what I'm hoping is going to be a really interactive session, because frankly, we can probably all learn from each other far more than you'll ever learn from me. So I asked to sort of frame this. I'm hoping that the key message with the whole thing I'm going to talk about will be how to avoid running out of cash. And there are a few themes that we'll come back to that are on the screen. So here we go. So as Christine very kindly introduced me, I spent 30 years turning around companies. I started off as a company doctor. I say that I was in the army for 12 years, but I ran my own business while I was in the army. They told me I couldn't, but they wouldn't let me leave either. I was subject to a time bar, having done a degree. But I eventually escaped, went off to business school, and then became a company doctor for 10 years before going back to business school to research, turn around for a doctorate, and setting up K2 to really try and invest in companies to turn around, although we find ourselves advising a lot of companies as well. The goal, of course, for those of us in the turnaround industry, as opposed to those in insolvency, because of course the insolvency world are all representing creditors, trying to get money back for creditors. In UK, we believe turnaround is aimed at saving a business, settling it down, and making sure it's a viable business for everyone involved, all the stakeholders, to resume growth. But as part of that, it needs systems and processes, resources, and this is why I think you're going to hopefully like the fact that I've used Yoda as the metaphor of the wise FD. We'll get there. So 30 years of failure, and I suppose my view is that everyone will tell you what to do, how to do it, but actually very few people take responsibility. But we all need good financial information, and I'm hoping you'll all agree with that. Although bizarrely enough, it's extraordinary how many businesses do not invest in the information and the resources and the systems they need, which normally fall under the bailiwick of a finance director or a CFO. But when it comes to survival, the whole thing, I think, is all about running out of cash, because that's why companies go bust. And this is where FDs are critical. And certainly every listed company that I've been asked to go and to turn around as a chief executive, I've also always taken the role of FD. Somehow it sort of makes it personal. I'm going to treat this almost as a workshop where I'm hoping to get you all engaged, telling your own stories. And when we set this up with FD Recruit, we discussed how to frame it. And I think at the time we were, contemplating the prospect of a recession. I think it's probably fair to say that we're dealing with uncertainty. So it's planning and forecasting in uncertain times. The good, the bad, and the ugly. I don't see this as FDs as being bad or ugly. I want to just show who the heroes are, because actually, if anyone's going to make a right decision, it's got to come from financial information as a general rule. And I thought a few tips, a few stories about what might be done in a crisis when there's some demands for debt might be useful. So the aim of this session is very much to get everyone sharing experiences about, what they've done, foreseen, seen, what they may have done in COVID, if that was an existential impact for business. And hopefully we'll all come away from this session learning how to never run out of cash. So preparing for uncertainty, we might all agree that we need to do a bit of planning. We need to have some forecasts. And in doing that, we've got the foreseen event. So this parachutist, I don't know if you can see it, but he's about to land in the water, which is probably what he planned to do, but he failed as part of his planning to recognize that the shore was lined with crocodiles. So, I'd like to think that this was a foreseen event that he could have spotted when he was modeling his plan, because, with a bit of data and the sources of data are critical, he should have been able to foresee some consequences. And this is where the financial model for all of us is critical, and developing it is quite difficult, because most people, in my experience, use Excel. They might take data from financial information, from accounts, and bring it forward. I would argue a lot of it is much more a form of budgeting, where we take data from last year, we manipulate it a bit and come up with next year's forecast. But often that's a budget approach to forecasting, whereas modeling a business and doing something for the first time requires a little bit more thought. And in this respect, I'm hoping that you might actually share with me who uses forecasting or modeling software other than Excel. Does anyone use anything unusual? So has anyone come across financial planning and analysis software? There are some big ticket ones. Does anyone use SAP, Oracle, any of the IBM products? No. So I'm going to assume that the lack of response from everyone is you all use Excel. So do you all use Excel to do your forecasting?
Yeah, I find the modeling tools that they don't have the flexibility of Excel, and you get narrowed down into a particular route that the model wants you to go. And with Excel, you can do absolutely anything.
And Tony, Excel is a fantastic tool. It is flexible. Some people like Google Sheets because they find it easier to pull data from other sources into it. But I get a sense that Excel for smaller companies is easy, but as soon as you're starting to pull in data, in particular live data from a lot of sources, that becomes a challenge. As indeed does working with large amounts of data or complexity, where often we end up with lots and lots of tabs in a workbook trying to model it, and then spending our life trying to sort of chase an error. Is that a fair statement, Tony?
Well, what is fair is that most users of Excel don't know Excel well enough, which is problematic. If you really take the time to know Excel, you can perform miracles.
I think that's right. I still believe that for larger companies which are pulling in very large sources of data, there are other tools which probably make it easier to both automate the importing of data and just make it easier to manage, almost a spreadsheet of spreadsheets type tools. The problem with a lot of software tools for planning in the market are you almost have to run your business their way, in particular with ERP systems. But developing a model is quite a challenge. Has anyone else developed a complicated model, or is it?
We've got a couple of chat messages actually. We've got Mike Achillea, who said he uses Moderna, is it?
Okay, I'm not familiar with
Moderna. I don't know,
How
Mike.
does that work, Mike? Sorry,
we can't hear you, Mike.
Your mic is switched off or something. It's not switched off, but we can't hear you. Was there anywhere else, Chris? Well, Mike.
We've got Geraldine McLaughlin there. Do you want to just have a a chat, Geraldine? You mentioned that you're investigating options, so it might be good to get some insight, maybe.
Yeah, we're I've just started a new role recently. I'm like 180 days into an FD role for a company that is growing quite rapidly. So we have entities in 4 different locations throughout the world and expanding on that. So the current system is Excel, and it's very, very clunky, very cumbersome to work with now. So we're currently looking at a few different options. One of the ones that I looked at recently was SAP, but we haven't formalized on any particular one yet.
I mean, the interesting thing about SAP is it requires you to fundamentally embrace it and change every aspect of the business, because it is an ERP system, brilliant for a stable business. But as soon as you're trying to deal with change and model uncertainty or model scenarios, it becomes slightly more difficult. And I use slightly advisedly.
Yeah.
Mike, are you back on? We used to know about Moderna. I'm not on. Okay, well let's keep going. You know, certainly trying to develop a forecast model is a challenge, but guess what? An FD doing that, or the finance team doing that, means that they do own the data, although it can be a challenge sharing it with others or giving it to others in a way that they can understand it, because I get a sense that a lot of people really struggle when they're seeing a very much data-driven output, trying to make a decision.
I'm on the call at the moment. Is there any chance?
Sorry, I think he was on the phone.
Sorry, yeah.
Darcy just made a really interesting comment, which I think was quite funny. I feel about Excel the way Winston Churchill felt about democracy. It's the worst possible system apart from every other system yet invented.
Who said that?
Darcy.
Sorry?
Yeah, that was me.
Darcy, fantastic. Have you tried any other systems?
Yeah, I have. Oh, excuse me. I have, and I think to echo the comment you were making, and I've worked in various sizes of businesses, in larger and more stable businesses, I think it can work quite well to have something set up, although I've never yet come across something that gave me real confidence in terms of cash flow forecasting, specifically at a granular level. But I think the challenge in an SME, and currently I'm in a business which is turning over like 10 million. The challenge we have is there just isn't the level of formal processes and systems, and there isn't the level of data granularity easily available to automate that stuff. So all of the problems with Excel, like, you know, error trapping, which is the absolute killer for me. But, you know, it's another year. I've now got to extend my spreadsheet out another 12 months and go through all the pain of setting all that up. I get all of that. But the flip side is when something happens which is kind of outside a process, it's relatively easy to fix and move forward, and you can do it in an informal way. So, you know, my experience of automated systems has been in large groups where I was in an operating business, and they've kind of come down, they've said, this is what you need to use, and we've done it. And it's worked fine, but I haven't had to actually do the hard work of the design of that system.
I mean, I think, you know, look, it is this trade-off between flexibility and you know, the sort of control that a lot of large companies like. Certainly for smaller companies, you know, 10, 25 million below that level, I agree with you, Excel makes sense. But once you're starting to import live data, a lot of people spend a lot of their time just inputting data. The automated feeds pulling in stuff, you know, can be difficult. They're very difficult to often reconcile data sets with different sort of definitions. Some of you might be old enough to remember WinForecast. Not many of you, but WinForecast was bought by Sage about 20 years ago, and Sage abandoned into Sage Forecasting, and they abandoned it about 10 years ago You know, bizarrely enough, about half a dozen of us around the country still use wind forecast, and none of us have come across anything like as good, because if you set it up right, it automates the reconciliation between the balance sheet, cash flow, and the P&L, and it reconciles. As long as you start with a balance sheet that balances, it is just amazing. But you just can't get your hands on it, and the problem is no one's come up with anything similar, as far as I know. But Excel is what most people use, and we're slightly, you know, we do like it. For bigger companies, there are a number of FP&A type software products. I say that because I have a vested interest in one of them, if anyone deals with larger companies, but it's definitely large company forecasting, and it solves every problem that most people raise about rigidity, because it doesn't interfere with the existing system. It's a satellite system that pulls data, but it doesn't interfere, unlike most software systems. Anyway, look, forecasting our main tool. Does anyone?
Tony, can it's Anton. May I sort of comment on something I've just seen from Oliver? Oliver in the notes was saying it's hard to persuade non-finance people, and I'm really curious around that, because, and maybe you're going to get onto this, and I don't know what the presentation looks like. I'm just wondering about the role of, the role of sort of FDs and CFOs in and around ESG, and how that's going to interrelate to their role of forecasting, reporting, etc. So I'm wondering if the sell is going to become easier to non-finance execs. Maybe that's something for the end. It was just an interesting comment from Oliver about the hard sell.
Well, what has been interesting is having acquired a company that does big ticket forecasting. I've spent the last 4 or 5 months speaking with finance directors around the world, and we've got offices in London and New York with this software, and the software we bought basically does forecasting for global businesses, FTSE 100 businesses, and we're bringing it down into mid cap. But the interesting thing is that most FDs who don't use software, who rely on Excel, understandably are very skeptical about all the claims by the salesmen they all meet about the software they sell. And so I get that, and I think skepticism is a feature. Most of the business we get, and this is a company that's been going for 40 years, has been from people who've seen it and used it, but new clients are really, really skeptical. I'm going to come on to it, but I think the FD's role for a lot of things is to say no, which is why I suspect a lot of them don't spend a lot of time, which they might regard as a waste of time, looking at this sort of software. It's very painful for many businesses to embrace and put in, which is why we generally stick with tried and tested. Excel will be around for a long time, I think. Anyway, I think we've probably done this. If unless anyone else, Gordon, you've got a
I was just going to say that when I looked at non-Excel products at a former employer, I found the problem was that they didn't offer a long enough projection horizon. So most of the products I looked at could only cope with a couple of years. And if you're a startup, obviously you need to be able to prepare projections right out to cumulative profitability for investors. So I phoned up the head of FP&A at a former FTSE 100 employer, and I asked them what they used, and they said, "Oh, Gordon, we use Excel." So I thought, hey, if they use Excel, it's good enough for me.
No, and that's exactly the story I hear everywhere, Gordon, because the alternatives are very difficult to get your head around. There are a lot of salesmen out there. There's a lot of snake oil out there. We're right to be skeptical, and it's a difficult for startups. Absolutely, Excel is the answer, because investors understand it as well.
So the challenge with Excel, of course, is the operational risk inherent in it. But there's a very good Institute of Chartered Accountants article actually on how to minimise operational risk in Excel. So I just read that and adhered to it.
Well, it'd be useful to send the details to Chris Schneider, and she can hopefully distribute them.
Yeah, I'll probably have to send it after the call because
Yeah, after the call. But
yeah.
I meant just anyway. So let's see if we can move on. We've been talking about modelling tools, you know, developing the model, you know, doing stuff, and I think it's generally reasonable to accept that it's a forecast-based plan. What I'm not sure there is general consent out there is whether or not it should be integrated balance sheet, P&L and cash flow. And therein lies a lot of devil that gets in the way of a lot of stuff, because I would argue the secret to growing a business that's sustainable is to grow a balance sheet. But very rarely do I ever see a balance sheet forecast. Anyway, the trite statement is failing to plan is planning to fail, and I hope you all agree with that. Of course, none of us can predict an unforeseen event. However, you know, having a plan means you can change it. No plan, and you haven't got a starting point. And this, so you know, we've had COVID, we've had a number of events. Who'd have predicted the current issue with the supply chain coming through the Red Sea? These are difficult things to predict, but at least we owners of the data hopefully can adjust the model. So this is where we come on to the fact that decision making requires this information, the data, and it all comes from you and from FDs. So I've decided that, or I thought, what we need to do is find an example of the wise one, where of course data gives us knowledge, and if we use knowledge wisely, we can make the right decision. But of course, forecasts can prove anything. So you all produce most of the data. The great beauty is it's the ownership of the forecast, it's the ownership of the data, it's the understanding of the data that is absolutely critical. And it staggers me how many people, how many boards of directors make emotional decisions without the data. There's another factor, which is reading documents. I seem to recall that when General Motors acquired Mercedes-Benz for 25 billion, presumably dollars, not a single director of General Motors read the sale and purchase agreement. It was no surprise that they lost their 25 billion. So the FD is the wise one, and I found a Jedi statement, a Jedi quote, which I've sort of cannibalized. The Jedi's strength flows from the Force. Well, I think it's the Force of the forecast. Yeah. A bit cheesy, but it is a source of wisdom, and I'm really hoping that you know, we have a voice, all of us, in decision making, because all too often I think boards of directors and often sort of entrepreneurial chief executives think that the finance function is peopled by those that say no, those that get in the way, and all the rest of it. But actually, we should be able to prove why their decisions are right or wrong, and at least influence the decision. And I also always believe in carrying a resignation letter that's undated. I've only had to use it once. So we come to this final bit before we sort of have a bit of a chat between us. But surviving insolvency. Insolvency is quite a powerful word because it tends to concentrate everyone's mind. Most people use things like technical insolvency or a short-term cash problem or the rest of it. But let's be very clear, if you can't pay debts on time, you're insolvent. Any company with a time to pay agreement, they were insolvent before they reached agreement with a time to pay. And certainly a lot of small businesses are characterized by one of two problems. They either have lots of money or no money at all, and it can be a real struggle. So what might be done? And we can have some, we hopefully some interesting anecdotes, and I'll try and share a few. but the focus is essentially on cash. And I thought it might just amuse you, and you can push back. I've got a few principles that I sort of spout and try to abide by, and there are lots of reasons why business schools don't agree with these, but there are others that I think they're valid. One is no debt. Bizarrely enough, almost every single one of our companies doesn't have any debt or loans. What we do believe in is borrowing money to buy fixed assets. So we might have a 3-year loan, but all loans are repaid. The concept of refinancing debt is an anathema. None of our companies have any invoice discounting or factoring, but everyone will tell me, oh, you need that to fund growth, which is entirely valid. But we're not living in a growth market. We're not living in a market where a lot of companies are growing. If you're not growing, you shouldn't, in my view, need to be factoring the book debts or borrowing against them. And this is the issue of the £100 company. You know, so many companies have got no capital, certainly when they start, but they don't see it as their whole focus on life is to build resilience by building a balance sheet and understanding things like quick ratios or current ratios. Modeling a business. We can model businesses to run out of cash, to never run out of cash. I'm running a startup. It's raised millions of pounds. It will never run out of cash because I won't let them employ anyone, and I won't let them enter into a contract, which means they have to pay money that they haven't got in the bank. So as we raise money, we will enter into agreements to spend it, but we don't spend it when we haven't got it. We'll never run out of money. I can tell you this, the rest of the board are very frustrated because they want to spend money they haven't got. Reading financial documents, I can't believe how many people don't understand termination clauses in documents. It's always astonishing when, you know, they enter into agreements and it costs them a fortune to come out of. Never capitalize non-recoverable expenditure. There's a Pareto rule, you know, 80% decision today is often better than no decision at all. Anyway, I'd be interested to know what principles you might have before we talk about what we might do and where we might find some cash. Has anyone got any sort of overarching principles that you sort of try and enforce on business? Any takers, Geraldine?
I've joined insolvent companies since 1999, and before that I was in a startup. So my whole working life will last 25 years, 26 years, has been with companies that have barely got money to pay payroll at the end of the month. And your main problem is when you've got stock. More companies go bankrupt during growth periods than during contracting. And the company I've just finished at, there was, between paying for your stock, the first payment for stock, paying a deposit, to getting money in from your debtors, there was a 10-month lag. So you've got this accumulation of 10-month stock that you've got to finance before you get any cash in. And that's very problematic. But so what I do is, with a company being loss-making, you can't get conventional finance at all, but it's very easy to get asset-based finance. So if I buy a vehicle or something like that, I'll always finance it. So I'll finance whatever I can, whenever I can. And then with creditors, it's a matter of prioritizing them. Number one creditor is salaries. There must always be enough money to pay salaries. And then you must pay your bank, you must pay, and you must make sure that your operational assets are always available. So you pay your rent. And then I do find with your creditors, we do have a cash flow problem. You know, 80% of them are very small. So it's pointless messing up the relationships with 80%. So pay those guys And then the ones that you negotiate terms with are the big guys that actually make a difference. And if you're in a situation where you can't raise finance, I have often paid interest to creditors, the big creditors. So it's a win-win situation. I'm giving them interest on money that they wouldn't be able to get from a bank, far higher rate. And I'm effectively getting an overdraft facility that I can't get from a bank. So there's no harm paying, and you get a happy situation. And then just the last golden rule I've got is never, if I can use the language, bullshit your creditors. They must trust you, and never make a promise that you can't honor. And if you can't make the promise, you explain to them you can't make it. And I've often been in a situation where I said, phone me next week, and then I'll know whether I can make that promise or not. Because the moment you renege on a promise, then you lose all credibility, and you've got to keep your creditors on your side. So those are my golden rules.
Very sound advice, Tony. And what experience you got with credit insurers who often become a problem for large suppliers? Because that can be a real issue, isn't it?
You know, I haven't had that a lot. But my biggest supplier in my last company, in fact, did have credit insurance, but I developed, once again, a completely open relationship with them. And they told me that if the debt was not paid within 90 days, then they would have a problem. So we were able to work together to that maximum period. So I made sure that I paid him within 88 days, so that and sometimes we could, because we were working together, by delaying his invoice from 1 month end to the first of the next month, he effectively got another 30 days on it. So it's a matter of working together with your creditors with a very open relationship.
Yeah, no, very sound advice. And stock I always think of as sort of cash that's sitting on the shelves, and I get a sense a lot of companies do not basically manage their, what I would call their stock turn, and that is, differentiate between the sort of the current stock that's being used for sort of current sales, and then stuff that's either obsolete or sitting there. I say that because one of the unusual experience I had in the 90s, Apple asked me to go and deal with all what used to be called Apple business centers. This was long before they set up their own retail chain. They used to have business centers that they provided soft finance for, and they all had Apple stock. But when I went to see them, the stock was generally between 300 and 500,000 in shops, over the southeast, which is where I was visiting them, and they couldn't get the stock that customers wanted. All the stock on their balance sheet was obsolete stuff, and it was extraordinary. I remember seeing monitors that were the shape of an A4 piece of paper, because that's what Apple at one stage was trying to flog. And there was a lot of stuff that wasn't moving at all, and yet the shops couldn't get their hand on the hot products that customers wanted. It was a fascinating experience, but the only answer was to turn it into cash, and we were getting between 5 and 15p in the pound for, frankly, obsolete stock. But it's better as cash than it was as stock.
Well, I had an experience with, it was actually a motor spares company. It had massive, in fact, the biggest warehouses that I've ever seen of stock. And you can imagine with motor cars to have spares available for every car on the road is very, very difficult. And they had a 40% availability, which sounds very low, but if you consider every car, it's not that low. But when I joined the company, they had very, very serious cash flow problems. And they believed that, the whole thing was getting money in faster from the debtors and paying the creditors slower. But I concentrated on stock. And I, in fact, reduced their stock levels by 25%. I reduced their inter-branch transferred, and they have 14 branches, also by about 25%. And I increased the availability from 40% to 80%. And it's all a matter of having the right stock in the right place at the right time. And don't try and have 100% stock for a market like motor spares. Go for 80% because 80% of the vehicles on the road is a very small amount of vehicles. But by reducing the stock by 25%, I increased the cash flow by 25%, and that made all the difference to the business. So stock is, if you're in a business with stock, that's where you need to concentrate your cash flow efforts.
Yeah, I'd second the point on stock. I work with a business that's one of the things it didn't do very well was negotiate good minimum order quantities with its suppliers. So they ended up, when they placed an order, potentially they were getting 40% more stock than they really needed to satisfy orders, and they weren't managing expectations about delivery times, lead times with customers, and so they would try and keep stock in, but then find that customers didn't want it. So I agree. I think if there's a large stock holding, there is always lots of opportunity to manage working capital and with stock.
So
as you say, reduce the temptation to be tempted to bulk orders and stuff. And I've seen that happen. People saying, "Oh, I can get it so much cheaper if I buy a whole lot more," but it just messes up your cash flow. So you've got to balance it up. So that's a very valid point.
Look, everything you say, I mean, and this is why modelling this stuff is so important. I think I'm right in saying that Hunter Wellington Boot was a British company manufacturing in Wales, I think. And they realised that they could manufacture Wellington boots in China more cheaply. So they decided to close their factories and move them. What they hadn't modelled or accounted for was the stock element and the prepaying for stuff that was on the water and all the rest of it. And it completely screwed up their cash flow, and they didn't survive with the new model. They had to be restructured yet again. Let me share something with you on stock, and I'm sure you're all aware of it, but I've not come across anyone doing it. And that is, most suppliers now want a supply agreement with what is generally referred to as an all sums reservation of title clause, which means they can seize any goods they have supplied, whether they've been paid or not, in relation to outstanding money due to them. A good lawyer, having a look at those agreements, should be able to say to you, you can send stock back. What I've often done is put stock on a lorry, the old stock that's not moving, sent it back and demanded a credit note. Great way of paying your bills. Has anyone got any other little stories about struggling with cash flow? Because Tony's obviously lived it for some time. Any other, you've still got a head of hair, Tony, so you've done rather well.
Tony, do you think there's a difference between cash flow and cash management?
Completely, but cash management, in my mind, is you plan to pay bills when you receive cash. So if you haven't got the cash, you have a difficult conversation with someone. To Tony's point, you can't make a promise without certainty. So absolutely, you say, when I receive this cash, I can pay your bill. You don't say, I will pay it next week, because if the cash doesn't arrive next week, you can't pay it. So cash management, in my view, is simply a function of knowing what cash you're expecting in, because you've got outstanding monies due to you, and knowing what cash obligations you've got and managing it. And sometimes you might be saying, well, I'm going to pay the wages this week and not make payments to suppliers. Where you get to with all of that is you often find that you don't pay the ones that are easy not to pay, and you end up with a bigger problem that you thought than you wanted. None the least if you don't pay HMRC, because eventually they might come through the door and take action. But this is where understanding the consequences of not paying someone is critical.
If I could just amplify that. Sorry, am I interrupting someone?
No,
No,
not at all.
I was just going to add in that, Tony, that actually brings you to the point of collecting your cash and how effective and good you are. A lot of companies that I work with, which tend to be smaller ones, part of the problem is whether they even ask for the cash when it's due. The other problem is if they get bullied by the very large companies, these mega corporations that insist on having 120 or even 180 days credit. And that in itself is a major problem, particularly if they then still don't pay you on time because they've got it confused in their system.
I couldn't agree more. Wasn't there an incident a while ago? We were all astonished to read in the press that one of the big construction companies had written to all their subcontractors and said, we've decided to move you from 90 to 120-day terms overnight. I seem to remember that Vesti Meats, they invested in this was some time ago, they invested in a computer system, and all of their suppliers, they said, we've got a new computer system. It's cost us £1.5 million. It's going to make everyone's life easier. Oh, and by the way, we're going to pay you on 90-day terms. Tough. You're absolutely right. I would argue it's all about the relationship. It's the contract. You don't have to do business with them. I think we should all feel very comfortable basically taking our customers to court if they don't pay, charging them late payment interest. You can build up all those late payment fees and late payment interest. You can make a demand of any customer who has paid you late for the last 6 years for each and every single late payment. And you're going to start seeing this because there are some clever people investing in these sorts of systems to basically extract the late payment fee and the late payment interest, even though you may have been paid. And all of us are going to, or should expect, to receive demands in relation to any customer, a larger customer possibly, who we have paid late, because there are some clever guys out there now starting to sell this to businesses. We'll go and collect the fees that are due to you.
So, but the other side of the coin is businesses tend to assume that they must give their debtors credit, and there's no need for it. There was a startup beer company that I kind of helped in passing, that was wanting to give credit to all the people buying the beer. And I said, absolutely no. They must pay you cash in advance of you supplying. I said, the example I always use is you go to a restaurant and you try walking out the door and say, I'll pay you in 30 days. It's nonsense. Or try and get onto an aeroplane without having paid for your ticket before you get onto it. So it's the same thing with business. You don't give credit unless it's necessary, because that cash in is critically important. And there has to be a really good reason for someone to not pay you up front. I've worked in the construction industry, and you can get deposit before you even start work of up to 80%. And that's where you should be. You don't want to get the money in too late.
Well, you raised two very good points. So first of all, when I said no debt, generally we pay bills when we get them, and there's a reason. I came across a company many years ago which supplied paint, and I learned a really valuable lesson from them. They supplied paint to retailers, and there was a retailer, a large retailer, that took a lot of paint off them, that paid them immediately. They got the bill, even though, strange enough, the bill did say 30-day terms. What happened? The lesson was, after trading for a while, next year, January or whatever, the paint supplier came to this retail customer and said, it's time for the annual increase in our costs, and so we're proposing to increase our prices by 5%. The customer actually was completely aware that the retailer the manufacturer factored their book debts, and said to them, well, first of all, are you unhappy with our business, with us as a business? Because we pay you promptly. You don't have to factor your book debts with us. And they said, we're very happy. I said, well, if that's the case, we suggest you go away and think about coming to us with a price increase. For many years, this particular retailer never got a price increase from that supplier. And it's a point in that it's back to the point you raised about relationships. And I think we should be much more in a relationship in the supply chain where we don't want our suppliers or customers going out of business, but equally we don't want to be taken advantage of. But the debt piece is a major piece. I try not to give people credit, and I don't pass it on down the line. And this is where factoring, in my view, is the biggest evil, because a lot of companies factor their book debts, and yet they don't pay their suppliers immediately. They draw down the cash. So their current ratio, their quick ratio, is completely destroyed. You mentioned the construction industry. It's a real shock for most people who are unfamiliar with it to discover that when you have a contract with a construction industry, normally JCT type contract, these big contracts to do a major project, the project might run for 12, 24 months. Once you've started the contract, the game is, of course, that the subcontractor or the contractor submits an application for payment from its customer. So subcontractors to contractor, contractor to developer very often. But they're all applications. They're not really debts. And the shocker, so the game is to make an application to get as much money as possible. And so these projects, they go cash flow positive quite early on. And what really catches people out is that an application is not a debt, such that nearer the end of the project, the game from the customer is to keep their supplier, their contractor on site, and therefore not be too fussed about overpaying, because once the subcontractor has done the work, only then do you really need to revisit all the applications and say, well, we've overpaid you, so we're not going to pay your final bills. Because the debt on a construction project is only crystallized on the final account when essentially the prime sum is agreed for payment. And that's a real shock. And a lot of suppliers, a lot of subcontractors don't get the last few months' payments, and they contractually have to stay on site, because if they want to dispute it, there's a whole dispute procedure that can take several months. It's brutal.
Can I ask a question before I jump? Tony, do you have a view on credit insurance?
Look, the reality is a lot of companies take it out. They need it because credit insurance is incredibly valuable if your customer goes bust. Because if your customer goes bust owing you a lot of money, it's existential. You go bust yourself. So it is incredibly valuable, but understanding it is also critical.
Thank you.
Look, I would argue, most of us, we've got to work out what is our business model. Personally, my preference is to have no one customer represent more than a percentage of a business. But when you're a small company, you're often having to fulfill big orders that might represent more than 50% of your turnover for a period. You might be dependent on a few customers, but you imagine being a startup who's got that wonderful first contract to supply a major supermarket with hair shampoo or with some product for dogs, or the sort of ones I've seen are vet sponsored pet food. And it's all hunky-dory, and you get all the big orders, and the small startup becomes a big company, and it enters into lots of contracts to manufacture products and all the rest of it. And then the supermarket stops buying. You're out of business. That's for crediting. That's not credit insurance. That's the business model. But if your customer went bust, you go bust because they owe you money. So, this is all about understanding the whole business, credit insurance and the business model. Should we just finish off this, and then I'll get rid of slide share, and then we can. What I wanted to do was just talk about cash in a slightly different way, in that there's cash to sort of fund the business, the working capital, and you could argue, and I hope you might argue, that, you know, yes, there is the efficient use of cash, but the efficient use of cash also can actually make a company very vulnerable to some disruption. So, you know, you need some form of working capital, you need some form of balance sheet, and that's why my no debt principle works for us anyway, in that it allows you to grow or shrink quite quickly. The only way, however, you can grow is by having an honest relationship, that if you've got suppliers who want to be paid before you get paid, you might need to actually revisit that whole relationship, which might be customer pays you or supplier does give you some credit, but is part of this whole relationship arrangement rather than a customer supplier relationship. And it speaks slightly to the inventory point that Tony made. However, there is also cash needed to invest in the business, to invest in the future, whether it's training or some sort of development or an investment in a new factory. And that's slightly different to continuous improvement type investment. And those sorts of funds, I would argue, really need to be modelled and planned, because too many people go out and spend the money without being completely comfortable about what to do if the anticipated business doesn't come through the door. You know, it's too often an emotional decision, an unplanned decision. So I would argue, you know, all of us need to almost have a sense of cash in terms of two buckets. One is just turning the business handle, and the other is to actually really invest in the business. My own personal view about investing in a business is it should be done with investment rated capital. I'm not even comfortable with long-term debt, but certainly, you know, I do like equity, I do like shareholders. And my view is slightly, if you can't persuade a shareholder or a new investor to invest in the business, why would you borrow the money? And along with a lot of borrowed money comes a personal guarantee. Have any of you been subject to a demand on a personal guarantee? You're lucky. Let me tell you, it's painful. We invested in a business, gosh, 25 years ago, 28 years ago, and it didn't work. And I got a demand from the bank and had to sell my house to repay them. And I was doing turnaround at the time. That was painful. So, you know, this whole, you know, investment in an uncertain outcome can be fraught with risk. And it's astonishing how many personal guarantees are out there. You know, Funding Circle will only, or until they got hold of C-bill loans, would only lend against a personal guarantee. A lot of invoice discounting and factoring is against a personal guarantee. I'm sure you advise everyone not to take out a personal guarantee, and then everyone looks around the table and says, well, how are we going to pay that bill? And people do provide personal guarantees. My argument is that's a failure of the business planning and the business modelling in the first place.
It's not so common in the UK, but I've done a lot of work outside this country, and it was the norm in every credit application. I'm just talking about from a supplier, that you, by signing it, would be giving your personal guarantee for that money, surety. And it was typically buried in the small print, and you have these long agreements that you've got to wade through, and you'll find somewhere in it that by signing it, you're signing personal surety. And I was always under pressure to open these supplier accounts, and as the CFO to be the signatory, and you know, it always kind of went on the back of the list, because I knew I had to wade through all the small print to make sure that I wasn't becoming personal surety. So one has to be very careful when opening an
So
account.
always read the small print. Now, interesting enough, there's a certain amount of case law in UK, and having sort of turned around a lot of construction companies, many years ago, again 90s, I came across the fact that Travis Perkins and a number of the other construction industry suppliers did exactly that. The supply agreement that you often entered into to get, let's say, the credit agreement to get £10,000 worth of credit included a personal guarantee. And the mad thing was 20 years later, and this is a situation I'd come across, when the director had left, the guarantee was still intact when Travis Perkins were exposed to £120,000 worth of credit in an insolvency. And they made a demand on the director who'd signed it 20 odd years ago. Brutal, it wasn't, it was 15 years ago. Brutal. Now, the case law in UK is that you cannot hide a personal guarantee in a credit agreement. It has to be very explicit, and normally there has to be some sort of evidence that it was a witnessed or an advised guarantee. But in some parts of the world, I think I'm right in saying in I don't know if it's Sharia law, but in the Arab world, the debt is not just a personal debt, but it's a family debt if you die.
Tony, I'm just conscious of time because we've literally just hit the hour. So some people are literally just scheduled for the hour. It's been so interesting. I really feel like we could go on for another hour just learning and listening. So I didn't mean to cut you off. I just think, you know,
entirely my fault. Time ran away with us.
Yeah, it's gone really
we
quick.
could go on talking for hours. I'd be very happy to, but I'm really hoping everyone sort of found this useful, interesting. I'm aware that not everyone stayed the course, but you know, did anyone not get from it what we set out to do?
Yeah, you didn't tell us about the ladies' toilets.
Ah, the ladies' toilets. So the reason I inspect the ladies' toilets is because many years ago, 3i put me in to turn around a company, and they hadn't paid the cleaners for about 3 months, and I was sort of wandering around this factory that evening after everyone had left and walked into the ladies' toilets, and they were beautifully clean and well kept, and they had some flowers on a shelf, and there were tissues, and I suddenly realized, you know, it was almost a sort of, because it was so clean, I realized that the women in this company had a huge amount of self-respect and they loved the company. So I got them together the next day and said, look, you know, what do you think? And actually they became the sort of the foundation sort of unit to save the company, because they so wanted the business to survive. And it was just a complete revelation to me. And so it made me realize that, you know, it was almost an example of self-respect and people who believed in their business. And I say it because I remember also having sort of consciously, since that event, inspected ladies' toilets, going to another company where, on inspecting the ladies' toilets, I found feces on the wall in a cubicle. I walked out the door and said to the directors, we're closing the company down. You know, your staff don't like you. It was the right judgment. So, you know, it's just an interesting little, you know, men's lavatories, ladies, are normally not very pleasant places.
There you go.
Don't waste your time. Look, hopefully that was interesting, useful. I'm very happy to speak with anyone for as long, or, you know, contact me by yourselves, but hopefully you've learned something. And Tony, thank you very much for your tremendous contribution. You probably should have been in my saddle.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you, everybody. It's been great. And Tony, are you happy for us to share your contact details after the session? And then if people want to kind of directly contact you, then they're free to do so. Brilliant. Thank you so much for the preparation and the delivery. It's been amazing. Really enjoyed it. And as I say, we'll share some contact details after the session and details on our FD and CFO network. For those of you who aren't involved, it's called the FD and CFO network on the Guild app, and you can continue conversations with your peers on that as well. Thank you. you.